Welcome to The Phantom at Frost Hollow Manor, a chilling Sherlock Holmes Christmas mystery where snow conceals sin and silence keeps deadly secrets. A phantom walks the frozen halls, but is it ghost or guilt? Where are you listening from? Let us know in the comments below. It was a bitterly cold December evening when the telegram arrived at Baker Street, its edges stiff with frost. Watson, seated by the fire, looked up from his newspaper as Mrs. Hudson entered, muttering about ghastly weather fit only for ghosts. Holmes took the message without a word, his keen eyes narrowing as he read. Urgent, come at once. A death under impossible circumstances at Frost Hollow Manor. The local constable insists it was suicide. It cannot be. Sir Reginald Havisham. Holmes handed the telegram to me, his expression unreadable. Frost Hollow Manor, he said softly. A place whose very name suggests mystery. Watson, we are invited to spend Christmas among phantoms. Within an hour, the hansom cab was rattling through the icy streets of London, the snow falling thick upon the lamps. The fog hung low, and the distant bells of Paul's tolled 8, as if warning us of what awaited. Holmes sat opposite me, fingertips pressed together, his sharp features illuminated intermittently by the flicker of gaslight outside. Suicide, they say, he murmured. Yet the man who telegraphs believes otherwise. Tell me, Watson, what is your first impression? That Sir Reginald is convinced foul play is involved, I replied. But if the local authorities have ruled suicide? Authorities? Holmes interrupted, a faint smile touching his lips, are often blinded by the appearance of the thing. We, on the other hand, must concern ourselves with the impossibility of the thing. When we arrived at Paddington Station, the frost had gathered thick upon the carriages. The express to Gloucestershire waited under plumes of steam, bound for the lonely countryside. There, somewhere amid snow-laden hills and leafless trees, stood Frost Hollow Manor, an ancient estate whispered to be cursed, where a man had apparently locked himself in his study, fired a revolver, and yet left no powder burns, no weapon, and no footprints in or out. As the train lurched forward, I caught the glint of amusement in Holmes's eyes. A locked room, Watson, he said quietly. At Christmas, no less. What could be more? Seasonal? He turned to stare out the window, lost in thought, as the snow swallowed London behind us. The rhythmic clatter of wheels seemed to echo the unspoken question that hung between us. What secret lay buried within Frost Hollow Manor, and what phantom awaited us there in the dead of winter? The journey to Gloucestershire painted frost upon the carriage panes, and by the time we descended at Brackenford, the air cut like glass. A single brougham waited beneath a swaying lamp. The coachman, muffled, touched his hat at Sir Reginald's name, and we were soon taken into lanes where hedges bowed under snow. Holmes sat opposite me, fingers steepled, his gaze on the darkness. Frost Hollow Manor rose from the trees. Above the door, a stag's head looked down. Sir Reginald Havisham received us in a vestibule smelling of pine. "You have come quickly, Mr. Holmes," he said. "It is my brother, Julian." He was found in his study, locked and bolted from within, the key upon the inside, the windows fast. A shot, then silence. They insist it was suicide. "And you do not," Holmes returned. Julian was reckless with money and proud as Lucifer, but he had just secured a loan to steady the estate. Our Christmas guests arrived tomorrow. He would not choose disgrace. Mrs. Bristow, the housekeeper, waited at the corridor. "Constable Sykes has gone, sir," she sniffed. "He'll return at first light." "The room remains as found?" Holmes asked, "as the constable left it." "Sir," Reginald replied, "I ordered it sealed." The study door was of old oak, iron-banded. The key projected from the inner lock. The bolt sat home. Holmes rapped, sniffed, and crouched to the threshold where a dusting of ash lay. "You opened by force?" "With a carpenter's saw, here at the lower rail," said Sir Reginald. He lay beyond. We entered upon that masculine comfort that is half library, half lair. Sober, calf-bound volumes, a Turkish rug, a deep chair by a low fire, and upon the desk the composed disorder of interrupted work. Julian Havisham lay upon the rug, features fixed in a cruel tranquility. A small wound marked the right temple. There was no stippling, such as powder bestows. Nowhere lay a pistol. "Where is the weapon?" I asked. "If we knew," Sir Reginald said bleakly, "we should not have troubled London." Holmes's glance travelled window to hearth and back. The casement was latched and rhymed within. He thrust his walking-stick up the chimney and dislodged a collapse of sooty feathers. "A rook," he remarked. "Irrelevant." On the desk, 3 objects refused to belong. A red ribbon singed at one end, a small glass phial, drained of colourless fluid, an envelope sealed with black wax. He beckoned me. The phial's mouth exhaled faint bitterness of almonds. The envelope, when shaken, yielded nothing. The ribbon's knot wore a brown kiss of heat. "Hydrocyanic acid?" I whispered. "Perhaps," said Holmes, "but the wound is no illusion, and the air lacks that harsh proclamation a recent discharge makes. Let us not mistake suggestion for proof." His finger traced the rug. "Note the nappa flattened track, not to the door but toward the escritoire." Something of weight was dragged and removed. Sir Reginald's composure trembled. "Who could have entered? What lies beyond that panelling?" Holmes asked. "The music room," said Havisham. "There is a concealed door our grandfather contrived. It was blocked years ago." Holmes's nail found a seam scarcely wider than a blade. He tapped and listened. Blocked, perhaps conscientiously, perhaps theatrically. We shall see. He measured the frost within the window frame. No smear, no thaw, no exit here for hours. A clock struck the quarter. Somewhere a draught stirred the holly, and a faint bell answered from chapel. "He liked the sound," Sir Reginald murmured. "He liked theatre as well," Holmes returned, considering the black-sealed envelope. "Tell me, had he enemies?" "Anyone who plays high invites them," Havisham said. "Last week he received an anonymous threat that by Christmas Eve the phantom of Frost Hollow would settle an old account." He laughed. Holmes folded his arms. "Phantoms, locked doors, missing pistols, and a ribbon kissed by flame. We shall require candles, twine, and your carpenter. Watson, your medical bag. If the room speaks truth, it will do so through minutiae." "And if it lies?" I asked. "Then we must make it contradict itself," said Holmes, and he knelt beside the body with an attention that banished the last whisper of the supernatural. Holmes motioned for Sir Reginald to leave them, and the door closed with a heavy thud, shutting out the faint hymn of wind through the chimney. The detective's movements became deliberate and precise, as though he feared disturbing the logic that hung invisibly in the room. He lit a taper from the hearth and held it low across the floor, letting the flicker crawl along the fibers of the rug. Dust motes and threads gleamed, then vanished into shadow. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "The rug's pattern betrays not only where the body fell, but where it did not. The pressure here," he indicated a narrow depression near the escritoire, "is too deep for the servant's tread. Someone knelt here, after death, to remove something." He traced a finger through the ash that had gathered near the hearth. Mixed among the grey powder was a tiny metallic glint. He used his penknife to free it and placed it upon his palm. A minuscule brass cap, scorched around its rim. "A percussion cap," I said. "Precisely, yet no weapon to claim it." He dropped it into an envelope. "The murderer, if such he be, fired elsewhere. A shot in this room would have awakened half the household." From his coat, he drew a small lens and examined the victim's hands. Clean, no residue of powder, no trace of smoke upon the nails. The right forefinger bears a slight indentation, yet too faint for recoil. Suicide fades further from probability. He rose and approached the bookcase. A shallow groove marred the polish near the edge. "An object recently moved a box, perhaps." Sir Reginald spoke of no safe. "There is one," came the housekeeper's tremulous voice. She had crept to the threshold, clutching a candle. "Behind that false volume, sir. Mr. Julian always kept it hidden." Holmes pressed the wooden facade. It swung inward with a sigh. Inside lay a narrow iron door, ajar. Its lock showed no violence, only manipulation. The safe's interior was bare, save for a single folded sheet and a playing card, an ace of spades singed at one corner. Holmes read the sheet silently, then folded it once more. "The paper contains figures and names," he said. "Debts, by the look of them. But the card is more theatrical than financial. Our phantom announces himself." He examined the singed edge and held it beside the burnt ribbon. The same flame touched both. His eyes gleamed. "The murderer wished to dramatize vengeance, yet the craft betrays impatience. This will prove his ruin." Sir Reginald re-entered, his face pale. "I heard movement. Is there progress?" "There is motion, at least," Holmes replied. "Tell me, who among your guests was expected tonight?" "Only Miss Clara Winslow, my fiancée, and Mr. Henry Vale, Julian's partner in the shipping venture. They arrive tomorrow. The servants are few, only Bristow, the cook, and young Timothy, the groom." Holmes turned. "Has anyone left the house since the discovery?" "No one. The roads are impassable." "Then our culprit remains within frost and stone." Holmes paced once more. "Watson, fetch the measuring cord. Sir Reginald, send Timothy for a ladder." When the items were brought, Holmes measured the height from hearth to lintel, then from lintel to ceiling. He tapped along the cornice until a hollow note answered. A flue extension narrow but sufficient for an agile frame. No one entered from the snow, but one may have descended from above. He looped the cord about a poker and thrust upward. Soot fell in a black cascade, bringing with it something soft and ragged. It landed upon the rug, a torn scrap of velvet, dark green, faintly perfumed. "Bristow," Sir Reginald whispered. "She has a winter cloak of that color." Holmes shook his head. "Too fine for a servant's cloak. This belongs to a lady accustomed to theaters, not kitchens." He held it beneath his lens. "Threads of gold embroidery, French manufacture." "Clara," Sir Reginald breathed. "She has such a rap." "Then let us reserve judgment until we test it," Holmes said. "Emotion clouds fact, and fact must guide us through this frost as a lantern through fog." He extinguished the taper, leaving only the hearth's glow upon the dead man's face. "Watson, we shall examine the upper rooms at dawn. Until then, the house must sleep. There is more to this phantom than rumor. He walks these corridors in living flesh." Holmes drew the curtains, shutting out the white expanse beyond, and the sound of the wind became a whisper like distant laughter in the chimneys, a laughter that promised secrets yet to be unearthed beneath the snowbound silence of Frost Hollow Manor. Morning came to Frost Hollow Manor with a brittle light that crept timidly across the snow. The house lay hushed, every board and banister seeming to listen. I had slept little, for Holmes had insisted we keep watch in turns. Around dawn, he roused me with that peculiar restlessness that heralded a revelation. His eyes were sharp, and his coat already buttoned. "Watson," he said, "our phantom is not a ghost, but a performer, and a clumsy one at that. Come." We ascend to the roof. The upper corridors of the manor were dim and narrow, hung with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow our movements. Holmes examined each window latch as we passed, then halted before a small panel door at the end of the west wing. Beyond lay a stair spiraling steeply into shadow. The air grew colder as we climbed until we reached a narrow attic, thick with dust and the scent of bird droppings. "Note the soot here," Holmes murmured, crouching near a vent that connected to the study's chimney below. "See how it is freshly disturbed, but only along one edge?" Someone placed a board to shield their descent. When finished, they removed it, yet the soot clung to their garment likely velvet. He straightened and examined footprints in the dust, 2 sets, one large, one slight. "A man and a woman, both here last night." The man's tread is deliberate, his weight centered. A professional, perhaps accustomed to climbing. The woman's print shows hesitation and retreat. She was not the instigator. I felt a chill beyond the cold itself. You believe she was coerced? Perhaps persuaded. Fear, Watson, often follows affection. We descended and met Mrs. Bristow at the landing, pale and flustered. "Beg pardon, Mr. Holmes, but there's someone asking for you arrived in a hired sleigh. Says she's Miss Clara Winslow." Holmes exchanged a look with me. "Interesting timing," he said softly. "Show her to the drawing room and ask that tea be prepared." Clara Winslow proved a striking woman of about 25, her features refined yet shadowed by exhaustion. She clutched a fur wrap about her dark green velvet embroidered with gold, the very twin of the fragment Holmes had recovered. "Miss Winslow," Holmes began, his voice gentle, "I regret the circumstances of our meeting. You are aware, no doubt, of Mr. Julian Havisham's death." Her eyes filled instantly. "Yes. Sir Reginald sent a messenger to intercept me, but I was already on the road. I cannot believe it, Julian. Gone. You knew him well?" "Too well, perhaps," she whispered. "Before my engagement to Sir Reginald, Julian and I were friends. He did not accept our parting with grace. His letters became strange. He wrote of debts, of a shadow that would come for him by Christmas Eve. I thought it drink or despair speaking." Holmes studied her face intently. "Your cloak. Miss Winslow, may I inspect it?" She hesitated, then unfastened it with trembling fingers. He held the hem to the light, where faint traces of soot marred the embroidery. "You have been near the chimney, or near one who used it," he said quietly. "I swear, Mr. Holmes, I have not been in that room since last year. Julian once showed me a secret door behind the music room panel, but I could never find it again." Holmes replaced the cloak and nodded. "I believe you, Miss Winslow. The soot tells truth, but not guilt. It merely binds you to a scene, perhaps unwillingly." He turned to me. "Watson, fetch Sir Reginald." When the baronet entered, his expression was strained but controlled. Holmes's gaze flickered between them. "Sir Reginald, your brother's death bears all the hallmarks of design. 2 persons conspired, one moving by intellect, the other by emotion. I shall ask one question. Where was Mr. Henry Vale last night?" Sir Reginald hesitated. "Vale? He was to arrive this morning, but good heavens, he sent a note yesterday, saying he would come early. I thought nothing of it." "Where is that note?" "In my study. I'll fetch." Holmes raised a hand. "No need. I found it there, unsigned. The handwriting is Julian's." Sir Reginald stared. "You mean?" "I mean your brother was lured to his own death under false pretense. Whether Mr. Vale wrote those words or another imitated him, we shall soon determine. But mark this, someone within this household aided in the deception." Outside, the wind rose again, moaning across the eaves. Holmes moved to the window and drew aside the frost-glazed curtains. Below, fresh tracks marred the pristine snow one set, leading from the stable to the chapel. He smiled faintly, almost to himself. "Watson, our phantom has left footprints after all. Let us follow them before the morning sun melts away the evidence of his folly." Holmes and I crossed the terrace toward the chapel, our boots sinking into the soft crust of snow that had fallen overnight. The air was sharp, every breath a ghostly plume in the pale morning light. Ahead, the ancient stone chapel rose from the frost like something half buried in time, its narrow windows rimmed with ice and its bell silent. The footprints we followed were fresh, one set broader and heavier, the other shorter and dragging, as though made in haste or fear. Holmes crouched, studying them with his magnifying glass. The heavier tread belongs to a man of middle height, strong but cautious. The other, see how the heel turns inward, belongs to a woman, uncertain, perhaps pursued. Both prints lead in, but none return. He glanced up, eyes glinting. Our phantom prefers sanctuaries, Watson. Let us oblige him. The chapel door yielded after some persuasion from Holmes's shoulder, and the hinges cried out like something long undisturbed. Within, the air was dense and cold. Dust veiled the pews, and the altar candles had long melted into waxen ruins. A single shaft of light fell through the stained glass, scattering crimson upon the stone floor. There, beneath the light, lay the end of our trail. The two sets of footprints halted abruptly beside a side door leading to the crypt below. Holmes lifted the latch, and the scent of damp earth and age rose to greet us. He gestured for me to light the lantern. Take care where you step. The truth often lies beneath the surface, sometimes quite literally. We descended the narrow stairs, the stones slick with moisture. The crypt opened into a low chamber lined with ancient tombs, their carvings nearly erased by time. In the center stood an empty bier, and upon it rested an object that drew both our eyes, a small leather valise, its lock broken, its contents spilled. Papers fluttered like ghosts in the draught, and among them gleamed something metallic. A revolver. Holmes lifted it with a handkerchief. Webley, service type, discharged once. He examined the barrel, sniffed the faint tang of gunpowder, recently fired. Yet not here. The air carries no trace of smoke. The shot was made elsewhere, and the weapon hidden in this sanctified place. I bent to gather the scattered papers. These appear to be shipping manifests, dates, ports, sums of money, all under Julian Havisham's signature. Holmes took one, scanning quickly, and the counterpart name Henry Vale. As I suspected, this partnership concealed more than trade. Smuggling, perhaps, or debt laundering, disguised as commerce. Julian sought to escape it, and Vale feared exposure. A sound interrupted us, a faint rustle from the far end of the crypt, followed by the creak of movement. Holmes motioned me silent, extinguished the lantern, and we stood in the dim red wash of light filtering through the stairwell above. A figure moved slowly, cautiously, its outline framed against the faint glow. Holmes stepped forward. "Good morning, Mr. Vale," he said coolly. The man froze, then turned. He was tall, wrapped in a heavy coat dusted with frost, his face gaunt and eyes hollow with sleeplessness. "Holmes," he muttered. "So you found it." "The revolver, yes, but not yet the truth," Holmes replied. "You arrived early, as your letter to Sir Reginald so conveniently arranged. You lured Julian to his study under some pretext, perhaps a discussion of debts, then staged the locked room illusion. It was clever, though not clever enough." Vale's mouth twisted. "You have no proof." Holmes struck a match, relighting the lantern, and the beam fell upon the papers I held. "You forged Julian's signature on these. When he discovered it, you feared ruin. You used his despair as your alibi. What better disguise for murder than the appearance of suicide?" Vale's eyes darted toward the stair. "And if I deny it? Then you deny too much," Holmes said evenly. "For you see, your boots betray you. The tread that led here matches the soot marks upon the attic vent. You dropped the weapon into the chimney, thinking the flue would conceal it, but the cold air above carried it onto the chapel roof, where you retrieved it and hid it here. Unfortunately, you left your companion's cloak torn upon the way." The man's face drained of color. "Companion, Miss Winslow," Holmes said quietly. "She followed you out of fear, not guilt. You will not implicate her further." Vale's shoulders sagged. "She knew nothing," he whispered. "Julian would have exposed us both. He gave me no choice." Holmes regarded him coldly. "There is always a choice, Mr. Vale. Yours was cowardice disguised as calculation." He signaled for me to take the weapon while he bound the man's wrists with his own scarf. "We shall let the constable earn his breakfast today," Holmes said. "Yet I fear the case is not complete. One question still chills the air of Frost Hollow Manor. Who sent the warning of the phantom before the crime was done? As we led Vale up into the wan daylight, Holmes's gaze lingered on the manor's distant windows, where the frost still clung in delicate webs. "Watson," he murmured, "the dead man's secrets are not buried yet. The phantom still walks, though its form may prove more human than we imagined." The wind howled across the moor as we escorted Henry Vale back to the manor, his face pale and lips tight with resignation. Holmes walked beside him in silence, his mind clearly still at work behind that composed exterior. Even after Vale's partial confession, I could see that my friend was unsatisfied. His eyes carried that restless gleam that meant a piece of the puzzle still resisted fitting neatly into place. Inside, Sir Reginald and Miss Winslow awaited us near the drawing-room hearth. The flames danced against the frost-streaked windows, casting long shadows that quivered upon the floor. When Vale entered, Miss Winslow gasped, one hand to her mouth. "Henry," she whispered, "tell me it isn't true." Vale could not meet her eyes. "I never meant for it to end like this, Clara. He threatened me," he said. "He'd expose everything and ruin us all. I only wanted to frighten him, to make him listen." Holmes cut him short. "Your revolver suggests otherwise. A man who seeks merely to frighten does not choose a loaded weapon." Vale's voice broke into despair. "He struck me. The gun went off. I swear it was an accident." Holmes regarded him coolly. "Perhaps. Yet what interests me, Mr. Vale, is not the act itself, but the elaborate fiction that followed. You had assistance, and that assistance did not come from Miss Winslow." Sir Reginald started. "Assistance? But from whom? Every servant in this house has been here under my eye." "Every visible servant," Holmes said softly. "But what of the invisible one, the hand that wrote the phantom's letter, the mind that warned of death before it occurred?" He drew from his coat the black-sealed envelope taken from Julian's study. This letter was intended to frighten its recipient into secrecy. The wax used is not of London make, but local Bristow's storeroom carries a stick of identical kind. The handwriting, however, is not hers. It belongs to someone more practiced at deception. Holmes turned the envelope over and handed it to Sir Reginald. "Do you recognize this penmanship?" The baronet's eyes widened. "Good Lord, it's my brother's." "Precisely." Julian wrote his own warning, Holmes said. "He invented the phantom. The letters, the rumors, the supposed haunting, these were his tools. He meant to feign his own death, disappear, and begin anew abroad. His debts, his scandals, gone with the corpse he left behind." Miss Winslow gasped. "Then he isn't dead?" Holmes's gaze darkened. "Oh, he is dead now." Vale ensured that. But the illusion began with Julian himself. When he arranged the locked room trick, he neglected to foresee that another might turn it against him. Holmes approached the window, watching snow drift past the glass. The flue passage, the concealed door, the missing pistol, each was part of his stagecraft. He likely intended to vanish into the night, leaving the impression of suicide. Vale, arriving early, confronted him amid his preparations. In their struggle, the plan collapsed into tragedy. I could not help but marvel. "But how could you be certain, Holmes?" He turned toward me, his expression grave yet satisfied. "Because every illusion, Watson, no matter how clever, carries the signature of its maker." The phantom's message bore Julian's flourish, the extravagant loop of the F in Frost Hollow, the heavy downward stroke in his H. It was theatre, not terror. Sir Reginald sank into a chair, covering his face with both hands. "So my brother sought to cheat death and found it instead." Holmes inclined his head. "Poetic, perhaps, though hardly admirable. He deceived all, even those who loved him. But one deception remains unresolved. Vale could not have moved the body alone after the shot. Someone else helped conceal the truth, someone within these walls." His eyes shifted toward the doorway where Mrs. Bristow lingered, wringing her hands. "You, madam, entered the study before the constable arrived. You locked the door behind you, did you not?" She stammered. I feared scandal, sir." The master said, "If ever tragedy came, I must protect the family name." Holmes's tone softened. So you cleaned what you thought was disgrace, not crime. You moved the weapon, swept the powder, and left the door sealed. Your loyalty, though misguided, nearly condemned an innocent man. Tears welled in the woman's eyes. Holmes turned away and addressed Sir Reginald. You will deliver Mr. Vale to the authorities. The law will determine the measure of his guilt. As for you, Miss Winslow, leave this house tonight. Frost Hollow has had its share of ghosts. When they had gone, Holmes and I stood before the dying fire. The flames shrank into coals, and the ticking of the clock filled the silence. So ends the phantom, I said quietly. Holmes shook his head. No, Watson. The true phantom never walked these halls. It lived in the hearts of men consumed by deceit and fear. And those, I fear, are the most persistent spirits of all. Outside, the wind sighed through the chimneys again, as if in agreement, while the last ember flickered out into darkness. The snow fell heavier as the afternoon waned, blanketing the grounds of Frost Hollow Manor in a silence that felt almost oppressive. After the confession, the house had settled into uneasy stillness. Yet Holmes was not at rest. He moved about the study once more, his long fingers brushing along bookshelves and curtains, as though searching for something the eye alone could not see. I watched him, noting that peculiar energy which always preceded his final deduction, the restless mind circling its prey. You are not satisfied, Holmes, I said quietly. He smiled faintly. My dear Watson, satisfaction belongs to poets, not to detectives. Something in this affair refuses to resolve. It rings one false note, like a violin slightly out of tune. Do you recall the small phial I found beside the desk on our first inspection? The one that smelled faintly of almonds poison, you said. Just so. It vanished from my pocket this morning. I stared at him. Vanished? You mean stolen? Precisely. And I ask myself who within this household would dare such a theft now that justice seems complete. No, Watson. Our play has one act remaining. A soft knock interrupted him. Mrs. Bristow entered. Trembling. Beg pardon, Mr. Holmes, but Miss Winslow, she's gone. Her maid says she packed suddenly and took the side path to the coach road not half an hour ago. Holmes's eyes flashed. Gone, indeed. Then, perhaps she means to finish what her accomplice began. He seized his coat and motioned to me. Come, Watson. The fog will soon rise, and with it, the truth. We hurried through the courtyard, the snow crunching beneath our boots. The sky hung low, a dull iron gray. Ahead, a faint figure moved along the path, leading toward the frozen lake, a woman's silhouette wrapped in velvet. Holmes quickened his pace, the tails of his coat whipping like dark wings. Clara Winslow, he called, his voice slicing through the wind. She turned sharply, eyes wide, startled like a cornered bird. Mr. Holmes, you should not follow me. On the contrary, he said, coming to a halt a few paces away. I rarely follow anyone without reason. You carry something of great interest to me, something that once contained prussic acid. Her hands tightened on the muff she clutched, and for a moment she seemed unable to speak. Then, her composure cracked, and the words spilled forth, trembling and low. I did not mean to harm him. Julian begged me to bring it. He said it was for himself. He wished to feign suicide but not die. I believed him. When he fell, I thought the poison had done its work, not the gun. Holmes's expression softened only slightly. Then why flee now, Miss Winslow? Because the world would not believe me, she said bitterly. It never believes a woman who loves a scoundrel. From behind us came the crunch of footsteps, Sir Reginald, pale and breathless. Clara, you should have trusted me. Her gaze wavered. Reginald, you do not know the truth. Julian was alive when I fled that night. I heard him groan as I ran. If Vale fired the shot, he did it after I had gone. Yet I left him there to die, and that guilt will not be absolved. Holmes stepped closer, his tone calm but cutting. And so you stole the phial to end your torment. Yet, remorse, cannot rewrite the past. Return with us. Justice will show mercy where conscience already bleeds." She trembled, the bottle glinting faintly in her hand. For a heartbeat, I feared she would drink, but Holmes, swift as thought, reached out and took it from her. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You have more courage than you imagine." Her eyes filled with tears as she sank to her knees upon the snow. Sir Reginald knelt beside her, his voice breaking. "You have suffered enough, Clara. The truth will save you now." Holmes turned toward the lake, the wind catching his coat again. "Strange, is it not, Watson? The phantom of Frost Hollow never needed chains or moans. It haunted the living with guilt alone, a most efficient spectre. And as we walked back through the gathering dusk, I saw him glance once toward the manor, its chimneys breathing faint plumes into the frozen air. "There lies human folly, Watson," he murmured. "In seeking to escape the past, we summon the ghosts that were waiting for us all along." The return to Frost Hollow Manor was made in heavy silence. The snow had thickened into a relentless white curtain, swallowing the path behind us until even the footprints vanished. Holmes walked ahead, his profile carved sharp against the pale glow of the lantern I carried. Sir Reginald followed, supporting Miss Winslow, who moved like one in a trance, her face colourless, her eyes fixed upon some inward torment rather than the path before her. When at last we reached the great doors, Mrs. Bristow met us with trembling hands and whispered fears, but Holmes brushed past her without a word. He led us once more to the study, the room where all threads of this cruel design had been spun. The fire had long since burned to embers. Shadows filled the corners, stretching like the spectres of those long departed. Holmes motioned to the others to remain silent while he struck a match and set the flame to a fresh taper. Its glow revealed once more the polished desk, the high-backed chair, and that empty space where Julian Havisham had fallen. Everything was still, and yet I felt as though the house itself were holding its breath. Holmes stood in the center of the room, his gaze sweeping from floor to ceiling with that keen precision I had come to know so well. Then, with deliberate calm, he spoke. "Before this night ends, there is something you all must see and understand. For though the murderer stands unmasked and the guilt confessed, the final truth of Frost Hollow remains concealed. There are secrets here older and darker than this crime alone." He crossed to the far wall and tapped upon the panel near the old fireplace. "You recall, Watson, I suspected a hidden passage behind this music room partition. The house was built in an age when noblemen prized secrecy nearly as much as wealth. What I did not yet know was that this passage was not merely an architectural curiosity. It was the artery through which deception flowed." He pressed against the panel, and it yielded with a faint click. A narrow door swung inward, releasing a gust of stale air. Beyond stretched a passage of brick and timber, lit faintly by the lantern in my hand. The space was narrow enough that one must move sideways to pass. Holmes stooped and entered first. "Bring the light close, Watson. You will note the footprints here, muddy, half-frozen, leading inward. Not from last night only, but several days past." We followed him down the passage, the cold biting through our coats. It curved sharply, descending toward the chapel crypt where the revolver had been found. The air grew thick with damp and dust. Holmes stopped before a small wooden table wedged into a niche. Upon it lay several objects, a candle stub, a ledger, and a roll of parchment sealed with wax. "Julian's refuge," Holmes murmured. "Here he planned his vanishing act. He had provisions, accounts, even instructions for his supposed resurrection under another name. But observe this." He held the parchment to the lantern. The wax seal was stamped with a sigil I had not seen before, a serpent coiled about a chalice. The emblem of a certain London society known to Scotland Yard, the Order of the Silver Chalice. Its dealings in forged securities and false credit schemes have ruined many. Julian was not only a debtor but a participant. Sir Reginald gave a low groan. "Then his disgrace was deeper than I ever knew." Holmes nodded slightly. "He intended to vanish with a portion of the society's funds. perhaps to begin anew abroad. That was why he feigned his death. Vale discovered the deception and saw his own ruin in it. The quarrel ended with a gunshot, but the chain of events was set in motion long before that moment. Miss Winslow sank onto a wooden stool, her voice a whisper, and I, without knowing, became part of his deceit. Holmes regarded her gravely. Love often blinds even the cleverest. Mind, Miss Winslow. But guilt must be weighed by intention, not by accident. You have erred, but you are not beyond redemption. He turned back to the ledger, scanning its brittle pages. Interesting, he murmured. Several entries correspond to shipments through the Bristol docks under the name F. Hollow. A deliberate jest, no doubt Frost Hollow. The phantom was his own creation in more ways than one. I saw then how weary Holmes looked, the furrow of concentration deep upon his brow. Holmes, I ventured, you have laid bare every deception. Surely the case is concluded now. He smiled faintly. Almost, my dear Watson. But there is one final matter, the unseen hand that carried the letters from Julian's secret den to the post, for he could not have done so himself without revealing his presence. Someone acted as his messenger. Mrs. Bristow's voice, tremulous, came from behind us. I did, sir. He gave me those envelopes, told me they were for the constable, to warn of trespassers. I swear, I never looked inside. Holmes's gaze softened. Then you too were but a pawn. Yet your loyalty, though misplaced, preserved his secret longer than he deserved. He closed the ledger and extinguished the candle. We shall leave this place sealed, Sir Reginald. Let the past rest beneath its frost. As we emerged from the passage into the dim study once more, the first pale light of dawn filtered through the window. The storm had passed. A faint pink hue touched the snow outside, and the manor seemed less sinister under the new day. Holmes stood by the hearth, his silhouette outlined in the glow of morning. Watson, he said softly, the living often create phantoms to escape their own conscience. Yet, in the end, the spectres they summon prove their undoing. Frost Hollow will be silent now, but I suspect its echo will linger in the hearts of those who dwelt here. Sir Reginald placed a weary hand upon Holmes's shoulder. You have brought light to my house, Mr. Holmes. For that, I am in your debt. Holmes inclined his head slightly. Truth, Sir Reginald, is its own reward and its own punishment. Take care that you do not seek to bury it again. As we departed, I looked back at the manor, its chimneys trailing thin wisps of smoke into the cold morning air. The phantom of Frost Hollow had been unmasked, yet I could not shake the sense that the house itself still watched, its windows like eyes that had seen too much. Beside me, Holmes drew his coat tighter and spoke almost to himself. Ghosts. Watson, whether of guilt, greed, or love, do not perish with the body. They merely change their haunt. And somewhere in this endless fog, they continue to whisper. And as the carriage carried us down the long drive, the great house faded behind us into the white distance, its secrets buried at last beneath the snow. The carriage wheels crunched steadily over the frozen road, carrying us away from Frost Hollow Manor, yet the silence between Holmes and me was heavy with all that remained unsaid. The storm had broken, but I sensed that in Holmes's mind, the winds of thought were still swirling furiously. His eyes, half hidden under the brim of his hat, stared out through the glass, as though following some invisible thread that reached back toward that desolate house. I knew that expression too well. It was the look of a man who had seen through the final veil, but who found no satisfaction in the truth it revealed. At last I ventured, "You are not content, Holmes. You solved the mystery, revealed every deceit, and restored Sir Reginald's honor. Why then this gloom?" Holmes leaned back, folding his gloved hands. "Because, Watson, every victory leaves a shadow. We have unmasked the phantom. Yes, but not the darkness that summoned it. The affair of Frost Hollow is not merely a tale of greed and guilt. It is the anatomy of human despair. There was one player whose hand guided events from the beginning, subtly, invisibly, and yet with terrible precision. And we have not yet spoken his name. I turned toward him in surprise. You cannot mean Julian Havisham himself? He is dead, Holmes. A faint smile touched his lips. His body, perhaps, but the mind that conceived this labyrinth of deceit, that mind survives in the ruin it created. Consider, my dear fellow, what man devises a plan so intricate, so theatrical, that it depends on his own apparent death? One whose intellect, though flawed, mirrors the structure of madness itself. Julian's every move was calculated not merely to escape consequence but to inflict guilt upon those who loved him. He engineered not a disappearance, but a haunting. I frowned. A haunting? Indeed, he wanted Frost Hollow to live on as his echo. He understood that guilt is a more enduring presence than flesh. Vale was meant to pull the trigger. Julian knew his partner's weakness, his temper, his terror of exposure. The stage was set so that even after his death, the house would remain his voice. That, Watson, is genius twisted upon itself. He fell silent again, watching the bleak countryside roll by. I saw then that this case had disturbed him more deeply than most. It was not the crime, but the psychology of it, the deliberate construction of fear that lingered with him. I began to sense why he had called it unfinished. By nightfall we reached the small inn at Brackenford, where we had first disembarked. Holmes ordered a pot of tea but barely touched it. Instead, he drew from his coat the ledger recovered from the hidden passage and began to examine it anew under the lamplight. The entries, faded but legible, stretched across several months. There is something inconsistent here, he murmured. Julian's accounts cease 3 days before his supposed death, yet the ink is fresh, less than a week old. Someone continued to write after his demise. I leaned forward. You mean Vale? Holmes shook his head. No. Vale could forge a signature, but not the peculiar phrasing Julian used. Notice this line, the debt is settled, the frost shall claim the rest. That is the writing of a man who knew he would die, not one who killed. And yet it was written after the fatal night, so either Julian survived longer than we thought, or another hand, one intimate with his thoughts, completed his work. A knock sounded at the door. The innkeeper entered, hat in hand. Beg pardon, gentlemen. A message for Mr. Savant. Holmes, delivered by express from London. Holmes took the sealed envelope and slit it open. His eyes narrowed as he read. From Inspector Lestrade, he said. Vale was found dead in his cell this morning. No sign of struggle. The guard swears he heard the sound of a bell shortly before dawn, though none were near enough to ring. A chill ran through me. You don't suppose? Holmes looked up sharply. Superstition, Watson. But coincidence? Never. Vale's death completes the pattern. The phantom has struck again, not from beyond the grave, but through one who lives still. He stood, pacing the small room. Julian's plan required a final act, a symbolic closure. Someone has carried it out, someone with access, cunning, and a reason to see silence maintained. Who remains, Watson? Sir Reginald, Miss Winslow, Mrs. Bristow. 3 witnesses, each bound by love, fear, or guilt. He paused, then spoke with quiet conviction. And of the 3, only one possessed the means to send that letter by express, the same black seal that marked Julian's parchment. Mrs. Bristow. I was stunned, but she confessed to nothing but misplaced loyalty. Loyalty, yes, Holmes replied gravely. But to whom? Not to Sir Reginald, not truly. To Julian. She had served the family since his boyhood. Even as he schemed, she guarded his secrets. And when he died, she took it upon herself to complete what he began to preserve his legend. She sent the warning letters, concealed evidence, and, when Vale's arrest threatened exposure, arranged his death, all in devotion to a ghost. I could scarcely speak. Then she is the true phantom. Precisely, said Holmes, and we shall confront her at once. We rode back before dawn, the horses steaming in the cold. The manor loomed from the mist like a memory refusing to fade. Inside, all was still. Holmes moved swiftly to the servants' quarters and threw open the door to Mrs. Bristow's room. She sat by the window, dressed, her hands folded in her lap. Upon the sill rested a small bell of blackened silver. "I knew you'd come," she said softly. "He told me you would." Holmes's gaze hardened. "Julian Havisham is beyond such counsel, madam. You have killed to preserve his illusion." She smiled faintly. "He isn't gone, Mr. Holmes. He said the frost would claim the rest, and now it has." Before either of us could move, she lifted a small vial to her lips. Holmes lunged, but too late. The bottle shattered, and she slumped forward, lifeless. The faint scent of almonds drifted through the air. Holmes stood over her, his expression unreadable. "The final servant of the phantom," he murmured. "She has joined him at last." The dawn broke pale and merciless over Frost Hollow Manor as we left it behind forever. The snow lay unbroken now, and no footprints marked our departure. Holmes spoke only once more, quietly, as though to himself. "Every phantom, Watson, requires a believer. When belief dies, so too does the ghost. Frost Hollow is silent at last, but only because no one remains to hear its bells." The inquest was held 2 days later in the little parish room at Brackenford, where the frost filmed the window panes, and the attendance, like the weather, was thin but keen. Lestrade came down from London with the brisk air of a man who prefers facts to atmosphere, yet even he lowered his voice when the church bell tolled for Mrs. Bristow. It was, I think, the one concession he paid to the ghost of Frost Hollow. Sir Reginald sat very straight. The weariness stamped deep at the corners of his eyes, and Miss Winslow kept her veil lowered. Holmes, who disliked theatrical proceedings when the play was no longer of use, watched with that distant courtesy I had seen in him at bedsides and deathbeds, an attentiveness turned to the living rather than the dead. When asked for his account, he gave it without flourish. He sketched the locked room device, the board laid along the flue to shield the descent. The weapon fired elsewhere, and then recovered through the chapel roof, the safe behind the false books, the ledger and the emblem of the coiled serpent about the chalice. He did not spare Julian. "It was his egotism," he said quietly, "to compose a disappearance as a dramatist composes a third act. The black wax, the anonymous threats in his own hand, the rumors he fed to the servants, these were not accomplices, but properties." He meant panic to speak when he was no longer able to command. Of Vale, he spoke without rancor. "A weak man may be dangerous, Inspector." Fear served the bullet more surely than malice. It fell to me to add the clinical details: the wound, the absence of stippling, the faint odor upon Mrs. Bristow's lips, which left no doubt as to the contents of the vial she had seized. Lestrade, for his part, produced the little bell of blackened silver. Its clapper had been daubed, not with poison, doctor, he said, glancing at me, but with the same black wax stamped by that queer seal. A signature, as Mr. Holmes would say. He had found the twin sticks of wax in the storeroom, bundled with string and a roll of old servant bell wire. She used the wire to thread the clapper through a grate in the corridor, he concluded, so she might ring it from the passage and never show her face. Phantom bells, eh? It put the fear of God into the maids, I'll allow. Holmes inclined his head a mere fraction. "You see, Watson, how a superstition is nourished by a small mechanism. The rook fallen down the chimney, the whispering draughts through the flues, a bell struck where no hand is seen, each is trivial alone, but together they become a legend a weak will may lean upon. The verdict, when it came, had the English compromise I have often observed: misadventure for the dead Julian, manslaughter for Vale with the coroner's rider, that subsequent events withdrew him from earthly judgment, and for Mrs. Bristow, death by her own act while of unsound mind. I saw Sir Reginald's knuckles whiten at the last phrase. Miss Winslow trembled, then steadied. She looked once at Holmes, and though he did not return the look, I knew he understood her silent thanks for the gentler shape his testimony had given her part in the affair. We dined that evening with Lestrade at the inn. The inspector was in his driest mood and tried to bait Holmes into professional amour propre. "You'll be saying next, Mr. Holmes, that you knew the woman meant to swallow the file. I hope to prevent it," Holmes returned. I was too slow. "Even you cannot be in two places," Lestrade said. But there was no sting in it. "I'll grant you the writing. It was a pretty observation, that flourish on the F. You noted it first night, I suppose. And then let us all run our heads against walls until the plaster fell." Holmes lit a cigarette and smiled. "If walls do not speak, Inspector, plaster sometimes will. I required time for the house to contradict itself. Frost that could not reform. Soot that could not fail to settle. A bell that could not ring without a wire. It is a poor thing to be certain too soon. One then becomes an advocate instead of a judge. When we took the late train to town, the sky over the moor was like a sheet of beaten iron, and the hedgerows glittered with ice. Holmes had been silent for some miles when he drew a small parcel from his pocket and handed it to me. Inside lay the burnt red ribbon and the singed ace of spades. "A stage manager's kit," he said. "Keep them, Watson, if you will. We have had cases in which a pistol and a bootlace were enough. Here a card and a ribbon did the heavier lifting." "You spoke earlier of unfinished business," I ventured. "Is it finished now?" "As finished as such things ever are," he replied. "The law has had its portion. Grief will have the rest. There is one matter only I regret." "What is that?" "That I allowed the woman's devotion to masquerade as loyalty." He tapped ash into the tray. "To serve a man is not always to befriend him, and to shield his vices is to share them. I might have said as much a day earlier and spared a life. Instead, I was exact." "You were humane where it mattered," I protested. He gave me a glance, half amusement, half gratitude. "A doctor's indulgence, my dear fellow. Permit me my own prescription. I shall take a dose of silence and a draught of Stradivarius for a week." Baker Street received us with the smell of coal and the comfortable grumble of Mrs. Hudson regarding boots upon rugs. Holmes submitted to her solicitude with good grace, then retreated to his armchair and the violin case that had stood, patient as a hound, through so many of our comings and goings. He tuned, tried a phrase, abandoned it, found another, a somber air that drifted about the room like the last flake of a snow squall that had already passed. I wrote my notes while he played. The clock beat its steady witness. Toward midnight, he set the instrument aside and poured 2 measures of the poor brandy we kept for storms and illnesses. "To the dead," he said. And when we had drunk, he added, "and to the living, who must make better use of their disguises." "You mean," I said, "make none at all?" He laughed softly. "Even you, Watson, put on a brave face when your shoulder vexes you. Disguise is not felony in itself. It is the purpose it serves that condemns it. Our phantom of Frost Hollow wore 3: greed, fear, and love. The first deserved its fate, the second we pity, and the third we may forgive. That is as tidy a summing up as a consulting detective need attempt. On Christmas Eve we received a card in a hand I recognized at once as Sir Reginald's, though the flourish was gentler than his brother's. It contained simple words of thanks and a small pressed sprig of holly from the chapel hedge. "Miss Winslow," he wrote, "had left for Bath with an aunt and would not return to the manor until spring. There were repairs to make, servants to discharge and re-engage, and a new rule he meant to keep, that bells should ring only for worship and weddings." Holmes read the card, set it on the mantel, and regarded the sprig for a long moment. "An admirable ordinance," he said at last. "Let the house unlearn its music and begin again." We sat then in a peace I have rarely known in Baker Street, the roar of London muffled by a fall of snow that did not, for once, promise trouble. When the last log settled, Holmes spoke across the embers in that tone he reserves for the truths he would rather not claim. "You see, Watson, how easily a clever man builds a ghost and how hard it is to lay one. The world is full of Frost Hollows, It keeps a detective in bread and a doctor in ink. It keeps a friend near his fire, I said. He smiled, one of those rare, unguarded smiles that warms a room more surely than coal. As you will, my dear fellow. There is in that a cure I have not yet improved upon. So ended, in our quiet sitting room, the affair which was to be known as the Phantom at Frost Hollow Manor. If any whisper still haunts those corridors, it is, I think, the rustle of a ribbon and the faintest chime of a bell, less a menace than a warning that secrets, once invited, will stay for Christmas and well beyond it unless the living show them the door.